Coming up next, an impossible countdown. Now, songwriters have stated many times that you never know where or when a clever lyric is going to strike. It's that way for a guitarist. I mean, a catchy riff can come at any time and from any place. You'll hear what I mean when we try to count down the best solos of the 1970s. So many great legends here. For example, one Axeman improvised a solo to impress a journalist who was doing an expose while riding on a tour bus with the band. He dared the guitarist to do it, and he came up with it right then and there. But was it classical music or was it rock? Another giant solo busted out when two genius musicians were on the verge of a bitter breakup. And then another came from the bassist. One of the greatest guitar solos ever, and the bassist did it. And finally, one that may not only be the best solo of the 70s, but possibly the greatest solo ever, where a genius was sculpting emotion out of thin air, topping off a historic song that has since become one of the greatest songs in rock history, but somehow it wasn't released as a single. It's the countdown of the top 10 guitar solos of the 1970s coming up next on Professor of Rock. Hey, music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. You know, if you remember this commercial...
He likes it! Hey, Mikey!
Regular, cinnamon, and raisin life.
You're going to dig this channel of deep musical nostalgia. Make sure to subscribe below right now. Also, make sure to check out our new podcast on Apple and Spotify and anywhere else where you hear podcasts. You can click here or click below. Well, a couple of weeks ago, we did the 80s, and I got some pushback, especially on Danger Zone and Tears for Fears, which I think are incredible solos. But, you know, I'm really going to focus just on classic rock here, just straight down the middle here. And really, this is much tougher because there are 50 solos from the 70s, easy, that could have made it into this countdown. But this one, I mean, 10, we've narrowed it down to 10. We'll see what you think. Coming in at number 10, when Queen released Killer Queen in 1974, it marked a bit of a turning point for the band. A sophisticated craft pop rock single that signaled their breakthrough. I got Killer Queen at number 10. Anchored within its theatrical flair and Freddie Mercury's poised vocal delivery was a moment of pure guitar brilliance. Brian May solo. Brian had just recovered from a serious bout of hepatitis, and Killer Queen was one of the first songs he tackled after joining the sessions for sheer heart attack. Surprisingly, though, despite his illness, his mind was still razor sharp, and his talented fingers hadn't lost a thing. The song's elegant music hall meets rock vibe required something different, though. Something that matched Freddie Mercury's flamboyant wit without overpowering it. Brian, you really delivered on Killer Queen. Rather than going guns a-blazing, Brian approached the solo like a composer, layering guitar harmonies in a carefully structured miniature suite. He used his homemade Red Special guitar, an instrument that he and his father had built together out of scrap materials, and ran it through a Vox AC30 amp to get his trademark warm singing tone. Now, the solo wasn't improvised. It was actually composed note for note. In fact, Brian famously wrote out his parts like orchestrations, and this one was no exception. Killer Queen became Queen's first international hit, reaching number 2 in the UK and breaking them in the US as well. And while Mercury's lyrics and delivery grabbed the spotlight, critics and fans alike took notice of the guitar solo. One of the greatest ever. She's a killer queen, got that agility. Coming in at number 9, we're going to hitch a ride and latch on to Tom Scholz's amazing solo on a deep Boston track. In the quiet confines of a suburban basement just outside Boston in the mid-70s, a tall, unassuming MIT-trained engineer was building something extraordinary. Surrounded by custom circuits, tape machines, and hand-built gear, Tom Scholz was sculpting not just songs, but a sound. Every note was agonized over, every tone perfected with the precision of a scientist and the heart of a dreamer. Among the many masterpieces he was crafting for his homebrewed debut album was a mysterious atmospheric track called Hitcher Ride, one of my favorites ever. Now, Tom, who wrote and recorded nearly every part of the song himself, he plugged his beloved gold-top Les Paul into one of his homemade rock band prototypes. Through a maze of compressors and sustainers and chorus effects, he summoned a tone that didn't sound of this world. It was warm, it was silky, it was soaring, like liquid light. On the final mix of Boston's debut album, it was released in '76, the solo on Hitcher Ride stood out as one of the record's many, many stunning moments. It wasn't just a guitar break. It was a journey, a sonic metaphor for the song's theme of liberation and a preview of Tom Scholz's rare gift, his ability to fuse rock and science, fire and elegance. Hitcher Ride, it wasn't a single, but it was a great example of the depth of that landmark Boston self-titled debut. Perfection, and putting Brad Delp's voice over it, it's just one of the most heart-wrenching songs of the 70s because it's a rock song, but also you have that melancholy from Brad Delp's voice. And you know, Tom Scholz doesn't get enough credit. He really was the Brian Wilson of the 70s, a genius as a producer. He did things nobody could do. All right, I'm excited about this next one. We've never covered it. Continuing with the countdown of the top 10 guitar solos of the 70s, we're going to shift into number 8 with Deep Purple and Ritchie Blackmore solo on Highway Star. So it was 1971, and Deep Purple were tearing down the Autobahn in their tour bus somewhere between one gig and the next. And there was a journalist that was riding alongside the band, and he asked the band, how do you guys write a song? Without missing a beat, Ritchie Blackmore picked up his guitar, John Lord leaned into his organ, and Ian Gillan started to well out a melody on the spot. And within minutes, the skeleton of Highway Star was born, right there in the bus. But it actually wasn't until they got to the stage that night that the band realized they had just ignited something explosive. First, they were just trying to impress a journalist, but when they heard the song, when they played it live, it was something else. By the time they recorded it for 1972's Machine Head, Highway Star had morphed into a high-octane fusion of classical precision and hard rock power. The lyrics scream freedom and speed. Nobody gonna take my car, I'm gonna race it to the ground. Nobody gonna take my car, I'm gonna race it to the ground. But it was Ritchie Blackmore's solo that truly unleashed the engine. Ritchie approached the solo like a man possessed, not just by the blues that most rock guitarists leaned on, but by the ghost of Bach himself. Now, Ritchie Blackmore had long been fascinated by classical music. He did this with Smoke on the Water, which had flourishes of Renaissance music. You know, the riff is done in fourths and fifths. A Highway Star, he fused Baroque scales with Marshall Amp Fury. I mean, this wasn't just shredding, it was architectural. Every note was part of a grand, accelerating design. Highway Star was one of the defining moments of Ritchie Blackmore's career and one of the earliest templates for what we would call neoclassical metal. And to be fair, back on that tour bus, when that journalist asked, how do you write a song, Ritchie Blackmore was the guy that blasted him with his guitar. And that was the evolution of that song from Ritchie wanting to prove himself right then and there. Very cool. Back to the countdown of the top 10 guitar solos of the 70s. It's what I call a cry of a broken heart. Eric Clapton's solo on Leila at number 7. Eric Clapton was already a legend. Slow Hand of the Yardbirds, Cream, and Blind Faith, but nothing in his musical life compared to the chaos happening in his heart. We've talked about this before. He'd fallen deeply, helplessly in love with his best friend's girlfriend, Pattie Boyd. It was a love that he knew he couldn't have. It was forbidden, and it drove him to the brink of obsession. Of course, inspired by a 12th century Persian love story about a man driven mad by unrequited love, Leila was Eric Clapton's confession in disguise. So he recruited Duane Allman from the Allman Brothers Band and assembled a ragtag band of misfits under the name of Derek and the Dominoes. They set out to make an album that bled with true emotion. But it was a title track, that really carried the weight of the whole thing. And right before the world got the now famous piano coda that we all know now is stolen, Clapton unleashed a solo that still cuts like broken glass. What makes that solo even more haunting is how it played against Duane Allman's slide guitar, like two souls chasing each other through the dark. Clapton's leads were sharp and jagged, while Duane's slide was ghostly, lyrical, floating just out of reach. But together they made a duet of torment. Like Leila and Manjan themselves in the story, circling but never touching. Leila wasn't a commercial hit at first, though. Over time, though, it became a monument. A song about love, loss, madness, and a soul that gave rock one of its most soul-shattering moments for sure. Exploding at number 6, I've got Edward Van Halen's incredible solo on Eruption by Van Halen. So it was 1977, and Van Halen was just another hungry band slugging it out in the smoky clubs of Southern California. But behind the walls of Hollywood's Sunset Sound recorders, something extraordinary was about to happen. Something that would change the way that people imagined a guitar could even sound like. At the center of it all was one EVH, Eddie Van Halen. Young, shy, and usually found with a cigarette tucked behind the headstock of his homemade Frankenstrat, let's be clear. He wasn't just a guitarist, he was a mad scientist, a tone-chasing wizard, a guy who didn't know the rules and he didn't care. And he played like the guitar was an extension of his soul, his heart and soul. During a break in recording what would become Van Halen's debut album, Eddie plugged in to warm up. No one was really paying much attention. He was just blowing off some steam fooling around with an instrumental piece he'd been toying with. He actually started it on stage at one point. It had no lyrics, it had no chorus, just pure instrumental fire. When Van Halen dropped in '78, Eruption wasn't even a full song, but it was a revolution. Guitarists everywhere dropped their picks, stared at their speakers, and said, "What the hell did I just hear?" That's how it was. Next on the top 10 guitar solos of the 70s, we welcome you to the Hotel California, where Don Felder and Joe Walsh jam in at number 5. In 1976, Don Felder was sitting in his Malibu home overlooking the ocean, guitar in hand. He wasn't trying to write the next big hit. He was just playing around with a progression that he liked. It was something dark. It had a cinematic feel. He recorded a rough demo of it. He layered it with a drum machine and some melodic sketches, and he sent it off to the rest of the Eagles, not thinking much about it. That simple demo became the skeleton of Hotel California, a song that we've covered like 4 or 5 times in the last few months. The song's now famous solo wasn't the work of one man, though. It was two, Don Felder and Joe Walsh, trading licks and building something that felt less like a typical rock climax and more like an epic conversation between two guitarists. But it was Felder who laid the foundation and led the charge. I take that back. It was really a conversation between guitars. The process wasn't quick, though. Felder and Walsh sat down with producer Bill Seismick and crafted the final solo like architects drawing blueprints. Just like Brian May did with Queen, Felder had composed much of his part ahead of time, note for note with meticulous care. Every bend, every transition between harmony lines, nothing was left to chance. He wanted it to feel melodic and structured and emotional, like a story being told in a powerfully dramatic way without saying a word. Hotel California, featuring the epic 2-minute and 12-second solo by Felder and Walsh, was voted Record of the Year in the 1978 Grammy Awards and the 4th #1 single for the Eagles on the Billboard Hot 100. The solo coming in at number 4 was delivered by Dire Straits leader Mark Knopfler on their signature track, Sultans of Swing. Oh man, what a solo. It was 1977 and London was crawling with punk. Everywhere you turned, guitars were snarling, chords were crashing, and anger was a fashion. But in a small club on a rainy night, Mark Knopfler witnessed something quieter, more subtle, almost invisible. A jazz band was playing to a near-empty room, utterly lost in their music. There was no applause. There's really no crowd energy, just pure musicianship. When it was over, the frontman gave a little bow and introduced them in a voice full of dignity and irony, a lot of confidence. "We are the Sultans of Swing." That phrase, that stuck in Knopfler's mind like the sound of a raindrop hitting the gutter. He went home, he picked up his worn red Fender Strat, and he started writing. We're the Sultans of Swing. Sultans of Swing started as a humble demo, cut in a tiny studio for like $120, but Knopfler's playing turned into something else entirely. And like the bombastic guitar gods of the era, he didn't use a pick. He played with his fingers, coaxing the notes out with a delicate conversational touch. It was poetry in motion. It was part country picking, part jazz phrasing, part rock elegance. Unlike anything on the radio. But you know, the truth is, Mark Knopfler didn't play like anybody else, because he didn't want to sound like anyone else. He played like a writer, like a painter. Every note on that solo was part of a larger picture, a tribute to the unsung heroes playing for the joy of it, even if no one was listening. Sultans of Swing was a smash, and man, it put disco on notice. Coming in at number 3, our top 10 guitar solos of the 70s, I got Ed King's breathtaking solo on Skynyrd's Freebird. You know, the legend of Freebird is one of those southern rock tales that seems carved into the side of a dusty highway. Epic, emotional, and stretching far past the horizon. You know, but behind its 9-minute sprawl and its mythic final solo lies a story of timing, instinct, and one man's quiet genius. The man was Ed King, and he wasn't even supposed to be a member of Lynyrd Skynyrd. He'd originally been in the Strawberry Alarm Clock Band. Yeah, the same band behind Incense and Peppermints. And he crossed paths with Ronnie Van Zant and the Skynyrd Boys, and the connection, it was immediate. They asked him to join, but not on guitar. He was going to be the bassist. He was supposed to be the bassist. King said yes, but he eventually slid into his natural home, the guitar. That move would change the shape of the band forever, and music. Ed helped write the famous Guitar Coda, a barnstorming 4-minute jam that starts with a slow burn and builds into a full-on southern rock firestorm. He wasn't the only one to play on it, mind you. He, Collins, and Gary Rosington all traded parts, but it was Ed King who brought the architecture of the song. He had a way of hearing harmony where others heard chaos. Ed meticulously wrote the harmony parts for Collins and Rosington, sometimes teaching them line by line. When it came time to record, it was all done in one majestic take. One take. By the time Freebird hit the airwaves in '74, actually Ed King had already left the band, The road, it had worn him down. The internal tensions were rising and he quietly stepped away. But man, his fingerprints are all over Skynyrd's signature song. The final solo that became an anthem, a punchline, a rite of passage, and a eulogy all rolled into one. All done by the bass player. We're all the way up to number 2, the bridesmaid position, and man, this was a tough one. Top guitar solos, this easily could have been number 1, but I gotta go with the majestic Jimmy Page, his solo on Led Zeppelin's epic Stairway to Heaven. Yeah, Jimmy Page had been piecing together the music for Stairway to Heaven in fragments. A finger-picked acoustic passage here, a descending progression there. He and Robert Plant sat by the fire, Page strumming as Plant scribbled down lyrics. It was slow, it was methodical. It was like building a cathedral one stone at a time. By the time they'd recorded Stairway at Island Studios in London, though, the song had transformed into a journey. 8 minutes of mystery, beauty, and power. The final touch was adding Jimmy's thunderous solo. Jimmy hadn't written it down, and there was no premeditated plan for this, just a rough outline in his head and a belief in something deeper. It was feel over flash. He walked into the studio, pulled out his Fender Telecaster, not the Les Paul, surprisingly, and he stood in front of an old Supro amp with a tiny mic in front of it, and he played the solo. He played 2 takes. He wasn't happy with the results. And it was the 3rd take when Jimmy locked into the flow of the song with a flurry of melodic runs that were not technical, they were spiritual. Just like Robert's eloquent journey. Jimmy Page once described the Stairway solo as an essay, not just a burst of notes. And that's exactly how it feels. It has a beginning, a climax, and a quiet understanding at the end. No flash for flash's sake. No tricks, just melody, soul, and that unmistakable Page tone, raw and honest, yet soaring. When the song was released on Zeppelin 4, the world changed forever. Stairway to Heaven became a rite of passage for guitarists everywhere, for anybody who doesn't play the guitar. Page's solo was a shining summit, completing what many regard as the greatest rock song of all time. Is it the greatest rock song of all time? I don't know. You tell me. Honestly, this number 1 was really, really easy for me. And it's one that was right on the money. It could have been in the 1980, though the album was released in 1979. Through the Void came David Gilmour's transcendent guitar solo on Comfortably Numb, which I excitedly award the number 1 position on the countdown of the top 10 guitar solos of the 70s. Came out in late 79. The Wall was Roger Waters' magnum opus, a concept album that spiraled deep into isolation, madness, and alienation. The sessions were tense for sure. The band was splintering, creative clashes were constant, and somewhere between the friction and the pressure and the long shadows of past success, somehow David Gilmour found something inhuman. And it came in the form of not 1, but 2 incredible solos. It's David's second solo, the final one, that was particularly dazzling. It wasn't just tacked on. It was the emotional core of the very song. The moment where numbness melts into beauty and all the pain that's been bottled up in Roger's lyrics come flooding out in notes instead of words. Of course, using his revered black Stratocaster, David Gilmour reportedly recorded between 20 and 30 takes of that final solo. And not because he wanted flash or even perfection, but because he was chasing feel, total emotion. Now, each take was a little different. A bend here, a pause there. He was sculpting emotion out of thin air. Finally, after countless attempts, he landed on the one. The solo that opens like a cry from a mountaintop and glides like a slow motion dive into your soul. And I'm not exaggerating here. It's not just complex in a technical sense. Every note speaks. The bends stretch with longing. The vibrato aches. The phrasing flows like a voice saying the things that the characters in the songs, the doctor, the performer, the broken soul can't. David's emphatic second Comfortably Numb solo isn't just an instrumental break. It's a revelation. The sound of a man reaching through the fog, through the drugs, through the metaphorical wall, and finding light on the other side. It's not only the most mesmerizing solo of the 70s. For my money, it's the greatest solo in rock history. And when The Wall was released, Comfortably Numb didn't chart as high as other Floyd singles. It wasn't even released as a single in the US. But that solo, it stayed. It became the solo. Fans would cheer before it even began in concert. Guitarists would huddle over their fretboards trying to capture the magic of Gilmour's phrasing, of his tone. For any guitarist, if feeling was the end goal, no guitar solo equals the emotion of Gilmour's solo from Comfortably Numb. And hey, the vocal is right there too. Now I gotta throw out an honorable mention. Burton of Air, his guitar solo in My Sharona by The Knack. My Sharona came out in 1979. It was the fastest debut single to reach platinum status since the Beatles. The Knack's lead singer and lyricist Doug Fieger, who passed in 2010, once joked that Burton's solo was so good it made Sharona more than a song. It made it a statement. A big reason why My Sharona was such a phenomenon was Burton's spirited solo that rips through the middle of the song like rocket fuel. Man, I hope you enjoyed the countdown. I don't think anybody's going to argue with my top 4 picks. I mean, it just doesn't get much better than that. If you like our content, we invite you to subscribe below. What are your memories of these songs? What are your top 10 solos of the 70s? Where'd I go right? Where'd I go wrong? Let's have a great discussion. If you enjoy our content, again, subscribe. We'd love to have you as part of our community. Till next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends.